We're the sustainability offices of Cascadia College and UW Bothell, and so we're hosting this event for you this year. Campus has not hosted this event, like I said, in 4 years, so we're really excited to bring this event back to you tonight. First and foremost, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we begin today by acknowledging that Cascadia College and University of Washington Bothell reside on the traditional and occupied lands of the Coast Salish peoples, past, present, and future. We honor their connection to the region, pay respect to Coast Salish elders, past and present, and join in solidarity through their struggles with continued systemic oppression. We commit to care for the land and the water, and center equity at the core of our learning. We ground our continued efforts to collaborate with tribal communities by listening, learning, and always keeping the well-being of tribal communities in mind. Joining us today are a number of amazing environmentally focused community organizations, a wonderful guest speaker from the Tulalip tribe, and local author Kira Jane Buxton, as well as 3 other amazing speakers. We'll take a break halfway through to watch the crows come in as the sun sets, and then begin to resume presentations again around 5:30. First up today, we have Dr. Doug Wacker. Dr. Wacker is part of our faculty here at UWB. His research is focused on the behavior of free-living vertebrates with a special focus on interactions between hormones and the brain and how they affect social behavior in birds like our very own campus crows. Please welcome Dr. Wacker.
Hi, everybody. Excited for another Crow Watch this year. So I'm glad to hear the land acknowledgement because I want to think about the land here a little bit because it really does relate to the birds that we came to see here today, the American crows that have a nocturnal communal roost on our North Creek wetlands restoration. So in the spirit of that land acknowledgement, why don't we all look out that window for a second and think about what that might have looked like in the early 1800s when the indigenous people of this area were the primary stewards of this land. What trees would we see? What animals would we see? How would it be different, right? Well, I can tell you, you wouldn't see a sports field out there. Student Rec Center, not there, right? But if you look beyond that, right, I guess figuratively, but literally as well, you look beyond the sports field, we see that North Creek wetlands restoration, and it might actually look a little bit like what it looked like a couple hundred years ago. And we know this because with loggers that came in the mid and late 1800s, there were surveyors, and this is a kind of an old survey map. UW Bothell's right there. It wasn't there in the 1800s, but that's just to give us some perspective of where we are. And this area, you can see the North Creek wetlands out there was a floodplain. There's shrubs out there. You can see North Creek kind of bending through that purple area there, which is home to UW and Cascadia and North Creek wetlands. And you can see it kind of wind through and hit Squawk Slough, which is now the Sammamish River. And you would have seen some trees out the window when you were looking out. You would have seen some western red cedar, some red alders, a lot of red alder now, and some Doug fir, right, some other trees. They would have looked a little different. Some were a little bit bigger back then. This is a cool photo from the 1890s in Bothell of a logger in front of a felled Doug fir tree. And really can't overemphasize the impact that this kind of logging and development had in this area, right? So by about 1895, this area was pretty well cleared for Northern and Western European settlers, right? So those trees were pretty much gone. And North Creek, that meandering creek we saw in that map, was straightened to facilitate the movement of logs for sawmills. Maybe not logs quite this big, but other logs that go down North Creek. So let's fast forward a little bit to the 1970s. So after all this logging had been done, and from about the 1930s on, this area looked like this, right? This is kind of a pasture land, the Boone Truly Ranch. That's what this looked like out here. So I guess I heard that Boone of Boone Truly Ranch had some relation to Daniel Boone, which I thought was really interesting, which is cool. But you can see this is just pasture land, right? And if we zoom out a little bit and have it look at an aerial photo in the 90s, before the University of Washington, state of Washington, purchased this land, we can get a really good look at that pasture land. And we can see North Creek just looks kind of like a straight irrigation ditch through that area, right? So it looks quite a bit different than probably what you imagined in the early 1800s, right? So the state of Washington bought this land in 1993 and had some big plans for it. They not only wanted a home for the University of Washington, Bothell, and Cascadia College campuses, but they also wanted to restore this kind of bottom aspect of this area to what it looked like a couple hundred years ago, right? And so what they did is they removed all the vegetation from this land, from that area, and with help of Army Corps of Engineers, they replotted North Creek from that kind of straight irrigation ditch to kind of more meandering natural creek, which they did this based on some old documents and what North Creek may have looked like. And then in the late 90s and early 2000s, they started planting native trees and native plants in this area. And with some real exceptional management by our kind of facilities and gardening crew here at Bothell and Cascadia College, this is what it looks like now, which is pretty amazing, right? This is a big success. Yeah, you should give the gardeners and facilities folks a hand, because this isn't an easy task. So as these trees and plants grew up, we saw a return of fauna to this area. We put camera traps out there, saw bobcats, coyotes, black-tailed deer, right? Salmon have come back to North Creek. I think Dr. Jensen will talk about that a little bit later today. Lots of cool birds, a whole honking group of anseriforms I think Dr. Valdez will talk about, as well as a lot of others. And then in 2009, an unexpected avian visitor arrived on campus. Thousands and thousands and thousands of American crows. Corvus brachyrincos is the scientific name. I'm going to show you a video. You're going to see this in a second anyway. And these are American crows circling the nocturnal communal roost on the North Creek Wetlands Restoration out there. And I took this video in maybe 2013. And a couple of things to look for is listen to the sounds. And then also, get a good count of how many birds you think you see. Should crank the volume. It's pretty impressive, the sound. So a couple of things. I said it's a nocturnal communal roost. It's nocturnal because the crows use this area in the evening, right? So around sunset to sunrise. Every day from late summer through spring, you're going to see crows out there, and the numbers change with the height in December and January. So it's nocturnal, it's communal. There's a whole load of crows that are using it together, and it's a roost. And the bird nerds in here know this already, but just in case you don't, a roost is different than a nest. So it turns out that American crows are seasonally breeding birds, like most of the birds around here, meaning they only reproduce at one time period of year, and they produce offspring when the resources are most plentiful, right? And then they go through this really physiologically interesting change where they shut off their reproductive system in what's called the non-breeding period. They stop producing gametes, they stop producing all the hormones associated with reproduction, and they just can't breed then. And the nest is actually serves breeding utility. They raise their offspring, they lay their eggs in the nest, they incubate the eggs, they raise their nestlings in this nest, but it doesn't serve a purpose in the non-breeding period. In the non-breeding period, they're not on nests, they're just in the trees sleeping, and that's called a roost. So this is a nocturnal communal roost. All right, so how many were there in the video? 16,000. Oh, 16,000. Some good guesses, actually. So one of the big questions that we get about this roost is always how many crows are there? And, we can't count them here, right? Because they just kind of twirl around and you count the same crow over and over again. But if you go and look at the crows moving towards campus, they're much easier to count. Somebody on YouTube called this a river of crows, which I thought was a really great name. But you can see they're all moving in the same direction. They're not kind of overlapping. And being a primarily undergraduate institution, Bothell, I enlisted the help of undergraduates. This is my 2015 animal behavior class. And I sent them all out in the different directions, and I said, find out where these crows are flying towards campus. And they identified what we call these hot spots of crow flyover activity. So the roost is the star, and the hot spots are the binoculars. And these are predictable in space and in time. About the same time relative to sunset, every night, they fly over these areas towards the communal roost. So we can go out and count them, and we've been doing that with the Pilchuck Audubon Society for almost 10 years. For their Christmas bird count, we go out second weekend of December and count these birds. This is Alyssa Brock. I want to acknowledge her. She was a student of mine when I first started at Bothell, but she's been helping coordinate this crow count for a number of years. She's going to be a co-coordinator this year. And here's our data. So each of those locations are listed there. And those are the years we counted. Took us a while to kind of get an idea how to do this. But we always saw anywhere from 10 to 15,000 crows. And that's where that 16,000 crows number came from. But look at 2022, 20,000 crows. So big jump, right? So how many crows? Upwards of 20,000, at least at the height in December. Another question that we get is, why do crows roost? And they roost for a couple of reasons. Protection from predators, we know. So as long as you're not the slowest crow, right, you're going to be okay when that owl comes around. Down at the bottom, this roosting, ground roosting on the sports field is kind of unusual. You don't see that much. I haven't read about that in the literature much, but it happens here, and they stay on the ground well into the morning on some of these sports fields, which is interesting. They also have this early warning system, right, where a crow, it only takes one or two crows to kind of sound the alert if there's an owl around, and the other crows will hear it and leave. And in fact, Brian and Zach, former undergraduates, took these great trail cam photos, and the crows were always in this tree until this owl popped up, and then they were gone for like a week. They didn't go to that tree. They were everywhere else. Right, so some anecdotal evidence of this early warning system. And then one other reason, and there's others I'm not going to talk about, is we think they might roost to exchange information. Now once they get on the roost, they'll be loud for a little while and then they'll quiet down. But when they come to campus, they form these big groups called pre-roost aggregations. And this is a picture by Bree McCloskey, a former undergraduate research assistant of mine. And they don't hang out on the building tops all night, right? They're just there for a short time, anywhere from 10 to 60 minutes, and then they go to the roost, right? But when they're on these pre-roosts, they're really loud, and I just want to show you a video from the top of Discovery Hall, and you'll see this guy will squeak, and then we'll have a call back here where the bird kind of bobs up and down. Kind of fun to get this kind of secret view of their life on these pre-roosts. There's that bobbing call. And we really don't know what these calls mean. And just finally, some undergraduate students now, they're using artificial intelligence, machine learning, to try to figure out what these calls might mean. So with that, I want to just wrap up and thank all of the undergrads that have helped me on projects. There's so many of them. And pass the mic off to my colleague, Dr. Ursula Valdez.
Credit to my colleague Diana Garcia. It's not a Garcia because I partnered with her to do some creativity and science. So I'm normally, I don't think I ever have done this. This is the first time. So thank you for inviting me here, and thanks for being here. This is fantastic, seeing so many people. I'm still shaking, a little nervous. I didn't think that I was gonna have the guts to do it. But it's so great to see so many crow lovers and bird lovers. Crows have a really bad reputation among certain part of society, so it's really great to kind of work with them. So what I'm going to talk tonight is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the natural history of crows. I bet many of you know, but let's kind of put that knowledge together. And then I'm going to show you how crows are really interesting for many more reasons than just biology. I'm an ecologist, but I try to find connections between birds and humans. And the other thing I'm going to tell you is that how I use American crows in this fantastic wetland restoration project as a tool for my teaching, okay? So let's talk about crows. So crows are actually a large family of not only crows, but rooks, magpies, jays, ravens, many species that are in this family. And they're actually distributed all over the world. There is no crows and corvids in South America. I'm from South America, by the way, originally, and I didn't grow up with crows. And when I moved to Seattle for grad school 20 years ago, I became fascinated. And John Marslow was one of my professors, and it was in my committee. And he taught me a lot about from my raptor work based on crows. But he always told me, you're not working with real birds until you work with crows. He'll be really proud. He is really proud of me now. He knows I'm teaching about crows. So anyway, there is about many species, at least 23 other genera besides Corvus, which is the genus for crows. There's at least 120 species of crows. Many of them are associated with humans. And there you go, the really great connection with humans and crows. And unfortunately, like in many groups of animals, we have at least 13 of them threatened by human causes in the majority of cases. So let's focus now on the species that we are going to see very soon here. And by the way, I was going to put a slide on the geese, cackling geese, and I do evaluations of the birds in the wetland. And this year has been incredibly fascinating to see the cackling geese arriving in Truly Lake, which is one of the lakes that are in the wetland. It's now a stopover habitat for migratory birds. And for that more reason, I want to thank everybody who's involved in working on this project, and those who are currently maintaining this project, and everybody who works with that. So it's an incredible place where we can not only learn about study birds and share that with the students. So anyway, we have many species of crows. As I mentioned, the American crow is the one that we have pretty much in North America. It's distributed all over the place in North America. We know that they eat everything. It's fascinating to see all the many things that they eat, from like in natural sources to fries. And they eat a lot of garbage, which is a little bit of an unfortunate story in there. And then they're actually great cleaners. They clean roadkill, and there's some of the things that happens that provide a service. And of course, they also come to bird feeders. I have to confess that I occasionally give, not that occasionally, but I give sometimes peanuts to some of the crows to come visit me, and they know me. And you know about that, they can recognize faces. So reproduction happens, as Dr. Wacker mentioned, in the spring and summer. They seem to pair for the entire season. They seem to be, because many birds seem to be monogamous, but actually they sneak up here and there. And that's something that happens in a lot of birds. They do really fascinating courting displays. If you've seen them, they give gifts to each other, they do flights like that, and acrobatic things, and then just trying to show how good genes they have. So pick me, please. And then they stay in the city or whatever they're nesting. So there's less numbers in the roost because at that time of the year, and during that time of the year, because they're very busy nesting, finding mates, finding a nest, and then taking care of the babies. So this is actually, and I'm not sure if I have time to play, but I'll show you. If it plays, maybe not. But I do constantly are taking videos and pictures of birds every single place, and that's something that I push my students to do. Observations of nature are good for many reasons. Pay attention to detail. Notice the world around you. And that's going to help you not only in biology, but in any place that you can be really good at paying attention to detail and seeing the world around you besides your phone walking around that. So, oh, there you go. So you can see here, this is an artist street. My husband and I go on walks, and I drive him crazy because I'm stopping all the time to take him pictures. And here is a crow just picking up some branches, trying to see which one is good for the nest. They nest in trees or sometimes in cities, in the ledges of houses or buildings. They spend at least 2 weeks building a nest. 2 to 4 to 6 eggs are incubated for about almost 40 days. And the young gain independence around 6 to 8 weeks. So they spend a part of time with their parents. One cool thing about, you can tell a baby crow by the color of the eyes, they're blue. And then if you can all see that little yellow around in the lower picture, that little yellow gap around the mouth, the beak, that shows a little bit of an indication that it's a young one. And I find them all the time. All right, so we all know that probably, just a little bit of details. I want to tell you how fantastic it is to have a resource that I can see right outside my window in my classroom and I can use for my classes. So I teach natural history, I teach ecology, and in particular I've been working on a class that is a first-year class that introduces to all the young students who sign for my class about nature. And it's not just about that. As I mentioned, I want them to focus on paying attention to detail. And then there's many other benefits that they gain from that. So the roost, it's an incredible resource for that. You heard from Dr. Wacker about the different interesting aspects about the ecology and the behavior of the crows. So I actually focus on exploration of natural history. And also, one thing that is really interesting, I don't like to focus in this particular class just on biology. I want to explore in the many other connections that humans have with birds, and in particular with crows. So how many of you know probably about all these different stories, right? One of the very early depictions of birds in the prehistorical paintings, it shows, I cannot, oh here, maybe you see it, no? I cannot show but you can see on the top picture a little figure of a bird associated to a dead person. There's actually, yes, association to crows and ravens to dead organisms, but crows don't bring dead. Crows are attracted to dead. And that is a difference. You can ask me later. That's a difference, okay? We can see some of the mythology of Japanese, the three-legged crow. Native Americans in this part of the world, and in many parts of North America, consider corvids, ravens and crows, actually sacred or inspiration for creation. So it's a completely different perspective that many of the westernized society has about crows. In the Hindu mythology, the medieval times about the plague, and although you know, there was like crows associated to that, and then there you go, the medical association. Corvids and humans associated to culture and art, right? How many of you know about the birds? Exactly, most of here, I think, are that generation. And then also, my students, even though they're young, every time they see this cloud of crows, they always talk about the birds. And I talk about the movie in my class, and I make a lot of disinformation breaking, because there's a lot of biological facts in there that they don't make sense in the movie. But it won an Oscar actually for special effects, which is really crazy. I can tell you more about that. So one of the things that I also do is I try, I'm passionate about birds, and sometimes I'm such a bird nerd that it transpires to some of the activities I do in my class, such as taking pictures in places where I feel that I can bring things. So this is in Bodega Bay, right the day before actually California was closing in the pandemic year, so we needed to actually escape from California. And this was Bodega Bay, and I have my husband to take a picture right in front of the school, which is a private house now, and they don't let you in. But I take the picture right, it's the same place on the image that it's on the left-hand side. And so I try to bring a little bit of that kind of culture experiences with my students. The other thing that I do, of course, I talk about ecological and behavioral studies. We all know about studies that have done in terms of like crows and corvids recognize faces. And not only crows, by the way, magpies recognize even themselves in the mirror. They can tell who they are. We've done a lot of, there's a lot of really interesting studies, including the study that Dr. Wacker is doing here. So I cover those so that the students have a good sense of what's the science behind that. So we learn all those different topics, and then also give them the opportunity to do a little bit of experiential learning. So I do observations with my students about events that are happening in campus, and also about the value of having healthy ecosystems, that once they're restored, they start attracting different types of animals and predators and so on. And we have bald eagles that actually feed on the crows. We have observed them, we observed the evidence of the owls also feeding on the crows. So my students have the opportunity to actually observe, make videos, take pictures, and then take data. I do a practice with the methodology that Dr. Wacker uses in his research, and I give them the practice to do. So there's one day which everybody from their houses counts the number, synchronously, the number of crows that are passing by their house, including myself, which I do that every day. Creative learning is a very key aspect of engaging people on nature. So sometimes if I ask my students, or I take a test, do you remember how many eggs there are in the nest of a crow? Okay, good student, but not everybody does, right? After like several weeks. So sometimes just testing memorization is not necessarily showing that you know things. Sometimes it's better, or well, I wouldn't say better. There's an alternative way to test if the students are incorporating knowledge. And one of the things that I do is I try to give them different opportunities to incorporate knowledge of what they learn into creative activities. So this is, actually that's Diana Snyder, and she's the one who taught me a little bit about movements and dance and things about crows. I didn't have the mask at the time, but we're doing some of the movements with the students and her. My students do naturalist journals, so they are learning about reflection, about taking notes, about observations and illustrations. And then they can do anything else that they want, that they can show a topic through their eyes, and some of these examples are here, so then they're showing the knowledge. And it's really fun to do that kind of stuff with the students, and you see that they're really engaged. And another thing that teaching about crows and about other birds has taught me, and has taught me, is that I can maintain connections with people that may not even know about crows. I grew up in South America. I told you I went to college in there. I have no idea about all this fascinating life of crows. So I partner with some colleagues in Peru, which I'm from, and other countries I've done it too, but in this particular case, it's from a university where they have a graphic design program, and we partner our students, and we have been, over the past this is the third year, we have collaborated in elaborating educational material for urban birds, and including crows. So the students decide with target audience they're going to be preparing their materials, and they create infographics with the information that they gather in here, and the Peruvian students can use the skills that they're learning in design and anything visual, and they can create these pieces that now they're being used by different people in different cities. So we have some material here. If anybody wants to use them, welcome to use them. We have things in Lima that they've been using by nonprofits that work in environmental education and bird work. And again, not only crows, but many other species that they can do. So with that, I want to thank you, everybody, and my students for being really great people to jump into this enthusiastic learning. And thanks for inviting me in.
All right, thanks, Stefan. It's great to be here to talk about some of the other members of our wetland community. So as Stefan mentioned, I'm a fish biologist, and I feel really lucky to be on a campus, well, it has fish, but it has some really interesting and unusual fish, as I'll say a little bit about. I was asked to say something about crows and salmon, Yeah, I'll say a little bit about crows, but what I wanted to do is start with a little bit about crow and salmon researchers. Turns out that Dr. Wacker and I were hired in the same search at the same time. And truth be told, I've always chafed a little at all the attention that the crows get. Everywhere you hear about Bothell, it's all about the crows. There's article after article about the crows, but not so much known about the fish. I think there's even a drink named after crows. So, that's another topic, never mind. So, I gradually made my peace with that, because what I've realized is not only am I lucky to have fish here, the Bothell campus, the Bothell area, has this remarkable combination of these wonders, these biological wonders in the air, as we've all appreciated, and on the football field, as it turns out. We have this awesome 50-plus acre wetland that's been restored. Dr. Wacker said a little bit about that earlier. And we have our own very unusual fish. Oops, let's see if I can get that going. There we go. We have our own unusual fish right here on the wetlands. That was taken just last week. It's probably going on right now. I didn't try to lead you out onto a nighttime foray to look for salmon, but for sure they're out there, and they're probably out there by the hundreds, which is really cool. So, to really appreciate salmon on campus and what's special about them, it's helpful to think back to, pretty far back to the time of glaciers, a time when this area was just starting to show up from underneath the glaciers. As the glaciers receded, this whole area was lakes. Deep, deep lakes. The outflow of water was blocked by the glaciers. And if you are a typical salmon, we'll use sockeye as an example, you know your lifestyle is all about hatching in the gravel. Go out to the lake, go from the lake out to the ocean where there's the big buffet, come back, spawn in the stream and die. So in my sophisticated animation of it, something like that. So that's the standard kind of salmon life cycle, certainly for sockeye. But that becomes a little more of a problem if you say are a sockeye salmon and there's something out there blocking your pathway to the ocean. Well, one of the things about sockeye is they're really good at managing to make do in fresh water because they live in lakes for a couple years before they go out anyway. So what happens in a lot of cases, including here, is that these fish that go out to the lakes and can't make it out to the ocean develop adaptations and specializations to make them freshwater only. So these are called kokanee salmon. They're the same species as sockeye salmon, but in these lakes where this happens, they all have their own special kinds of adaptations that make them particularly suited to that specific lake and those specific circumstances, which is nice. So when engineers come along and say, well, you know, we can make a pathway out to the ocean that's quite easy. 150 years ago, even after the glaciers were gone, it was still fairly hard to get out to the ocean. So, as many of you know, the Cedar River was brought into Lake Washington, the locks were cut, so there's a ship canal that goes out. So now it's quite easy for salmon to go back and forth. Whoops. But now kokanee don't. They evolved in this system. They go out to the lake, they mature, they come back to the streams. There are other salmon, many of them non-native, that were brought in and do the usual kind of migration out to the ocean, but the kokanee say, nope, this is my lifestyle, these are my adaptations, and this is what I do. And it's these salmon that would have been really abundant around here 150, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And in fact, they were in all these little streams into Lake Washington and Lake Sammamish and along the Sammamish River. I even remember seeing some real estate ads from the 1870s advertising this wonderful farmland out in the Sammamish Valley, and these runs of little red fish that appear every fall. So they were really conspicuous and noticeable to people. But, you know, they cover a pretty broad area there. Turns out their numbers are much lower now. Urbanization, many other things have been very hard on them. And, you know, of course, other people would have noticed a long time ago that these fish were here because they're well suited to the small kinds of streams we have coming in. So early settlers in the area would remark on the thousands of little red fish they would see in their streams. Native Americans had a very strong preference for these. There were many camps, seasonal camps along Lake Sammamish. and Lake Washington that were specifically oriented towards harvest of kokanee, so they were much sought after for that, and highly prized. So from these runs that were throughout the lakes, they were called early run when it was at Issaquah Creek, middle run is what we had around here, and a late run in some other streams in Lake Sammamish. After all the urbanization, all the changes, the picture a couple years ago was not super encouraging. The early run in Issaquah Creek was gone. The middle run was believed to be gone and to have been gone for some number of decades. And the lake run is just struggling along in a few streams in Lake Sammamish. Typical returns in recent years are something like 70 or 80 fish for that whole lake. So that's really getting marginal. So, you know, I had been doing some work out on Lake Sammamish, and I got to know those fish a little bit. And I thought, boy, you know, it's so sad that we don't have kokanee here. So I started looking, and no kokanee, and then I looked in the literature, and they're thought to be extinct. So I thought, that's so sad. And then I noticed, well, things like this. Let me get that out of the way. This is the Sammamish River at the mouth of Little Bear Creek. Those of you who know McClendon's Hardware will know the general location. In 2017, I started noticing there are these small fish that seem awfully kokanee-like. People thought, no, those are just introduced fish. There have been millions of fish brought in from elsewhere. What you're seeing couldn't be the native kokanee. And here I want to give a shout out to something Dr. Valdez said earlier about the importance of natural history and observation. This was just a complete stroke of luck on my part. I happened to ride my bike into campus. As I go along the bike in November, being a fish person, my eyes are drawn to the stream, and I started noticing these weird little red fish that were showing up. And somehow, this population either was misunderstood or had gone unnoticed after about, well, 80 or 90 years under the eyes of the second oldest school of fisheries in the world. So, oh, that's kind of cool. Those things look like kokanee. People were still a little bit suspicious. I should say that was my alma mater too, so I have to be nice. So, I started noticing similar kinds of things on campus. We have an assortment of great wildlife on campus, including beavers, who are very busy. Every year I get a little excited when I see their nice big beaver dams because I know that that's going to slow down salmon enough for me to get a look at them. People are often concerned, oh, you know, if we've got these big beaver dams, what's going to happen to the salmon? Can they get past? It actually turns out some years it slows down the salmon for a while. But the first big rain or two, you'll get these little rivulets going through. Fish will be able to make it over and around. So on balance, salmon are really good, or beavers are really good for salmon. So we have multiple beaver dams are starting to break up a little bit now, and I can stand down there at certain times, say after a good rain, and see 3 fish a minute, 2 fish a minute, 5 fish a minute, maybe there's a pause, see some more fish jumping. So this is a really extraordinary kind of thing for us to have on our campus. And I can do one more movie because I love these movies. And I'm a Mac person, so I always forget about the right click option. So this is just down the hill. And there's a nice big male kokanee. Didn't quite make it. It's actually a little distressing to see how often they try and how often they get caught right in that little V. They're swimming like crazy and not making it up and fall back down. Turns out they're pretty persistent though. So, yeah, and sometimes their aim isn't what it could be. So, I got more and more interested in these fish. I have a lot of students that work with me as well. One of the great things about having a stream on campus is it's pretty local. And so we do a lot of collecting. We've done a lot of genetics on these fish. And what we found, and it was a complete shock to me because it was, to me, what would be the most interesting possible outcome, is that these fish are native to the basin. They're kokanee. And this graph will be a little bit hard to interpret, but just to give you a general idea, those big circles on the right are sockeye populations, and this is just describing genetic variation in these populations. One of them is introduced on the lower right. Those 3 populations on the left in the circles are the kokanee that are in the basin. One of them is, we had samples left over from the Issaquah Creek run. the late run fish that are still here, and the middle run fish. So for me, and I think for a lot of other people, and for good reasons, this was a really nice and unfortunately fairly rare good news story about salmon. Isn't it cool that you could have something under the radar, native, thought to be gone, and then suddenly it just shows up in these great numbers. So this is one of the really nice things that we have here on campus. They are an important part of our wetland ecology. Get off the right flick zone here. They're an important part of our wetland ecology. Something you'll see most of the year, but especially prominently now, are herons perched right over spawning kokanee. It's not obvious when you look at the diameter of the neck of a heron how big an animal it can swallow. I have to say it's a little bit disgusting, but they are able to catch kokanee. That fish on the bottom there has this very characteristic hole in its side, triangular, that conforms exactly to the lower beak of a heron. They almost always hit them in just that spot. And then they either decide not to eat them, maybe get something tastier or fresher, or they lose their grip, or it's just a little bit too big for them and they just leave them on the side of the stream. So it turns out I owe a great debt to the herons because most of the samples I collect early in the year have that same hole in the same place. Otters also make big use of kokanee coming through this time of year. I see this grim tableau of fins and heads and bits of things. Often they'll go in and they like to eat the eggs and the brains. So they've got their special tastes. They're not always going to eat, the less appealing fins and so on. Often they'll leave enough behind that I can sample for genetics at least, so that's nice. So I have students working on this, as I mentioned. I think like Doug and like Ursula, I'm very interested that students find some kind of connection to this place and these organisms in this wetland, because I think your ability and desire to steward the place depends an awful lot on forming these connections. I'm always surprised when I run into students who don't realize we have a stream on campus, let alone salmon, which is part of the reason I'm here. I run a Salmon Watchers program in the fall, if any of you are interested. It turns out a lot of people, if they know we have streams, just assume that all the salmon are gone. That's not true. We've got lots, not as many as we used to, mind you, but we've got lots of salmon. There's lots to be seen out there and to become attached to. And there are reasons why we would want to know about this. The kokanee that I just described spawn in relatively few areas. It's almost all behind McClendon's and in Lower North Creek. I don't have full details on that picture on the lower right, but on the top you can see a bunch of fish that are spawning there. Down below, the arrow's pointing where that would be. Looks like late summer, maybe early fall, about the time kokanee would be coming in. We've got some god-awful combination of a coffer dam protecting a sewer pipe being put in on one side, construction bringing down silt from Little Bear Creek on the other. So people don't know about these things. It would be very easy to wipe out half or 3/4 or maybe all of the spawning habitat in one short period. Likewise, there's a lot of education about being salmon safe and salmon responsible, and messages like Puget Sound begins here. That's important, but that's also pretty abstract. If people can say, oh, you mean I can go in my neighborhood and I can go behind those houses and there are fish in there? Maybe I will do something with my rainwater besides divert it directly off of my roof into the creek. Maybe there's a reason why I want a rain garden, because I'm not only protecting Puget Sound way over there, but I'm protecting the very stream that's in my backyard. So one of the things that my students and I are very interested in doing is restoring kokanee to a lot of the little streams around here that no longer have them. So think of your local stream if you live nearby, Swamp Creek, Juanita Creek, McAleer, Lyon, Thornton, all of those would have had lots of kokanee. And we have some remote site stream incubators where we have eggs that are protected from predation and flooding and so on. Having found this native population here, it gives us a great source population to potentially stock some of those runs in other years. So look for that in the future. And I want to end with what I think is a very hopeful aspect about the present and the future. I was very touched when I saw a piece of art being dedicated down in Tawadi's Park, which is along Swamp Creek. And it turned out that blue disc you see, it's quite beautiful. It was done by Ty Juvenile. He's a Tule artist who's done actually quite a bit of artwork around here. And he had described that as being inspired by Kokanee, which had survived all the onslaughts of the many decades, much like his people. And I thought there was kind of a nice continuity and community there that, against all odds, some remarkable things can happen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much for our speakers, to our tabling partners and guests. If you have some feedback, we have QR codes for feedback forms on the tables in the back. And if you've checked out binoculars, please do remember to return it and get your ID back. Again, thank you all for coming. We'll see you next time.